And thanks. I'll say welcome again. We're here today on Wednesday, June 24th, to talk about new project applications for this year's Continuum of Care competition, otherwise known as the NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity. I am Shannon Quinn Sheeran with Housing Innovations, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Lauren Peretti, Liz Isaacs, also Miles Swensick is here, and Sarah Zoiderveen is here. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to all the participants for your time and your partnership throughout this challenging time. We plan to go 2 hours with some time for questions at the end. We want to encourage you all, if you have questions throughout, to ask them. And if we find that we're short on time, we might ask you to hold your questions. But if you do have them in the meantime, raise your hand or, put them in the chat. But again, if we're running short on time, we might ask you to hold them to the end. And I can stay on after, and perhaps some of my team can stay on after. All right. So I'm curious, how many of you, raise your hands or put it in the chat, how many of you were at yesterday's webinar? I'm not seeing hands raised because some of this, a few of you, yeah, I'm seeing. Okay. So for some of you, this is going to be duplicate. And also there are lots of slides here. And hold on just a second. My view got messed up. Excuse me. Okay, thank you. They're going to be duplicative, but there are a lot of slides here, right? So we're not going to go through all of the content in detail. And a lot of these slides are just going to be for reference for you as you create and walk through the completion of your new project applications. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge that this is a challenging time, right? And that everybody has, there are lots of feelings for perhaps frustration, perhaps stress, sadness. So I just want to invite everyone, like as I did yesterday, to take a deep breath. I know for me, coming back to my breath, it is an important part of stress management for me, an important part of how I take care of myself. I did, as I shared yesterday, this morning before this webinar, because I don't know if any of you get nervous before talking to people in a big group. I get nervous before, so I did a 10-minute meditation. So we just want to encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and know that we support you in that. All right, next slide. Here's the agenda today. We're going to walk through the timeline for new projects. We're going to talk about shifts in HUD policy priorities. We'll walk through, and this is where it's going to be much more like these slides are here for reference, right? We're going to walk through application basics, a little bit of an eSnaps refresher with content tips for this year, project applications, attachments that are needed. Then towards the end, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the actual transitional housing project type, since that is a new project type. It's like a new old project type, right? But we haven't had the opportunity to apply for transitional housing as new in many years. So kind of a refresher on what the concepts behind transitional housing type. Then we'll have time for questions and, of course, resources. So timeline. Wednesday, if eSnaps is open, which it is not yet, next Wednesday, July 1st from 10 to 11, we're going to have office hours. If eSnaps is not open, keep an eye on your email, and we'll schedule a different time for office hours. Monday, July 6th, new project applications are due, or 1 week after eSnaps open, whichever date is later. So what you're going to do is you're going to complete your project application in eSnaps. You're going to export that to a PDF with the whole application and attachments. And then you're going to submit to us by July 6th or 1 week after the date eSnaps opens in Zengen your new project application. Don't click submit in eSnaps. If you don't have a Zengen account already, then submit it to ctboss@gmail.com and email one of us, and our email should be on the last slide. Email your application that you've submitted it to our Gmail account. Then our team will review your applications, return with any feedback. You'll have up to 3 business days. If you can do it quicker, that's awesome. To get it back to us, submit it again in Zengen, and we'll do that process until we instruct you that it's all set and you're okay to submit that in Zengen. I mean, not Zengen, in eSnaps. So HUD's goals and objectives. This is the same slide I presented yesterday for those of you who were there yesterday. They're different this year. It's a different year. I don't need to say that, but I'm just going to say the obvious here. Promoting economic self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is a huge buzzword in this year's NOFO. So it's a big priority of this administration, and their definition of self-sufficiency, which may or may not be achievable for some of our program participants, but it's important to know what their definition is to be able to sustain on your own without assistance your own rent and utilities and those kinds of costs after you exit the program. So that is what the administration is going for. They prioritize treatment and recovery as a means to self-sufficiency, and of course, improving outcomes. That is not necessarily a different priority from other administrations, but they do target some specific things like encampments, reducing encampments. Of course, they want to see how the programs reduce homelessness, length of time homeless, returns to homelessness. How are your people going to be able to sustain their living situation after they exit your program? It's important to be able to talk about that and how you're setting them up for success in that. They want to see exits to permanent housing, and in particular, unsubsidized permanent housing. How are these programs going to increase employment income? Ending the crisis of homelessness on our streets. That's part of ending or reducing unsheltered homelessness, and of course, advancing public safety for all. How are you collaborating with law enforcement in your area? How are you reducing public camping, public drug use in order to address barriers to maintaining housing, increasing self-sufficiency? And it's a priority to provide trauma-informed care and increase safety. Increased safety, meaning participant and community safety. There is, for transitional housing, a service participation requirement. HUD is prioritizing that, and the CT BOSS Continuum of Care, Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care, in January of this year, the steering committee voted that all COC funded housing projects must require participation in supportive services as a condition of applying for new and renewal funding, except as prohibited by VAWA. So, and on top of that, the new transitional housing has a 20-hour per week service requirement. So in order to help fulfill that, there were a few resources linked on this slide: a sample service agreement, engagement principles, formerly known as Housing First principles, and implementation of trauma-informed and client-centered service requirement. So hopefully these resources will help you conceptualize how you can do that. And on the upcoming slides in transitional housing, the deeper dive, we'll talk about some ways that you can fulfill those requirements as well. All right, so we are, as I said earlier, waiting for some more information from HUD. eSNAPS is not yet open. Um, there are detailed new project instructions linked here. They're from 2024, so they're the most recent we have. When we have new instructions, we'll let you know that and let you know how to access those. Watch for emails for information on any of these changes in these slides. Application basics. Again, this is the detailed instructions from 2024 linked here. New project threshold. So HUD has always had a project threshold for new projects. The thing that's new here, like, so timely submission, complete application from an eligible applicant, those are typical, right? Even some of this demonstrated capacity and experience to carry out project, like that's why they ask you what they ask you, right? What's your experience? Tell us what you've done before. Tell us what you've achieved before. Tell us how you've collected funds from other providers before. So some of these are typical. And then at the end, of course, it says HUD reserves the right to evaluate the eligibility of applicants to ensure ability to adequately manage federal funds and comply with all applicable laws. So that's where I feel like that's where there's room for interpretation, right? But we're just giving you the information that HUD has given to us. And then, of course, this is also typical, but it's important when we're talking about new projects. HUD assesses all costs for reasonableness. So whatever budget you put forward, HUD is going to look at it through the lens, is this reasonable or is this not? All right. There are certifications. This is also new, required for this NOFO. So each applicant must say that they will not engage in illegal racial discrimination, operate drug injection sites or safe consumption sites, knowingly permit the use of or distribution of illicit drugs on property under their control, knowingly distribute drug paraphernalia, examples of which are syringe distribution or syringe exchange, and then safer crack cocaine or methamphetamine smoking kits. We imagine this is just going to be something on that. Again, like, we don't have the application, so this may be a checkbox. We're not sure what form that'll take, so stay tuned for more information on that. We're going to talk through some grant types in the next coming slides, and how you complete the new application for the 7 new transitional housing, interim housing projects that we're going to put forward to HUD. Approximately 20 grants that are transitioning from rapid rehousing or joint TH rapid rehousing to transitional housing, 2 DV bonus TH projects, and a PSH supportive services only project. So the link here is to those new projects listed there, what the name will be, and the total funds received. So that is a link to, and it's posted to our CT Boss website. It's important to use the project name. I think this is on another slide, but it's important to use the project name that's on this form because that relates to what we send to jurisdictions. It's called the con plan jurisdictions, and we have to get signed and then attached to the NOFO. So it's important to use the name we give you because that's the name that's going to match what's on the form that we send out. Okay, eSNAPS refresher. I already said these slides are here for your reference.
Before you move into this section, I just want to address a question that was in the chat that I answered in the chat, but just so that everyone knows. So we do know that it has been a motion in the existing lawsuit filed by NAEH and others. We don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. And right now, the NOFO stands and the deadline stands. So until we get any information indicating that the courts are intervening and that deadline is not going to stand, we have no choice but to move forward because we have to be prepared to submit a competitive application by the existing deadline, which has not changed.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, until we know otherwise, we're going to behave as if everything's due August 26th, and it is how we see it in front of us right now. Okay, eSnaps. What is eSnaps? There's a link here to the eSnaps toolkit, which is great for people that are entirely new to the system and even some of us who have used it forever, but not so often, right? So please take advantage of that resource. And it is where we submit new project applications to HUD for the continuum of care competition. I'm going to leave this here for reference, but if you're just getting started in eSnaps, look at the instructions on this slide about how to create a profile and then how to add applicants to your specific profile so that you can do the work you need to do to get this application completed. The applicant profile is something that can be created or updated at any time. You don't have to wait for this specific competition's eSnaps application to be open. So if you haven't already updated, we've sent out a few emails in the past month or two about updating that. If you haven't already done it, please go ahead and do that as soon as you can. It'll also help ensure that you have access to eSnaps as well, because that if you don't use it frequently, they may ask you to re-sign up again for it. Linked here is the project applicant profile, the navigational guide. Use that to update your applicant profile if you have any questions about what that is. We highly recommend that everybody has 2 eSnaps users. We have had situations where the one that the agency had has been in the hospital or unfortunately left the agency suddenly. So it's very important to have 2 people. And unfortunately, we know it's the summer, people are on vacations. So it would be great if everyone had that a backup for themselves, right? And we highly recommend that you add Miles, whose email is here, as a user to your account, because he can be helpful in many ways, right? If you're having issues, he can go and see what's happening and kind of guide you through or do some things for you if you give him permission. I mentioned that.
Just one point. I just realized I should have thought of yesterday. My username is Miles W. So that wasn't on the slide. So
So you'll need to know that if you're adding him, Miles W.
Yeah.
Thank you. I already mentioned it's important to use the project name that's listed on this spreadsheet because it's tied to the ConPlan certification, but here's the link again for you. Applicant profile, again, more ways to update that. I'm leaving there for you for reference, just so you know when you do get in there, applicants click on the profile, you have to go to the very end and click edit in order for the pages to become editable, the forms to become editable for you. HUD Form 2880, I'm going to leave that here for your reference. And now recently, HUD moved the indirect cost section to the applicant profile. So it's important just to be prepared to fill out that form when you are updating your applicant profile. And indirect costs, if you're not familiar, you can either use the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement that you have, or the NICRA, or you may claim the 15% de minimis. Now, if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, your agency must use that for all federal grants, and then you must attach it to the applicant profile. But if you don't, you may claim the 15% de minimis rate. The increase was effective on October 1st, 2024. There's lots of information on this recording and on the slides about administrative costs and indirect costs. And if you have questions about it, we encourage you to look at those slides. If you are a subrecipient and you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you may charge your indirect rate based on your NICRA for your portion of the grant. And just a reminder again to attach your approved agreement there. Completing the applicant profile, this just lists some of the different components of the applicant profile, contact information, review that to make sure it's up to date, your congressional district, your Form 2880, and confirm that your code of conduct is on file with HUD. HUD did a webinar soon after the NOFO was released, and it wasn't very long, maybe 30 minutes long. And they spent a good few minutes on the code of conduct. So please look at the renewal webinar slides that are linked here for more details on the code of conduct, but look for that and make sure it's on file with HUD. Nonprofit applicants must attach their 501c3 to the applicant profile. And of course, after verifying all information is correct, go to the submission summary page and click complete. Make sure that's complete because a lot of things populate to your application from your applicant profile. Okay, again, with the new project applications, there will be links for you. And I already pointed to links about the detailed instructions that we have, the most up-to-date ones for the new project applications. I just want to note that the screenshots here are not from 2026. Of course, the 2026 ones aren't available yet. But you should always select FY 2026 ones. These are here from 2021, but you're going to look for FY 2026 when you're actually setting up your new project application. This slide walks through how to create an application. Always confirm that you have the correct applicant listed on the field. Some of you may have access to DEMIS or DOH as well as your own agency. Make sure you're in the right applicant agency before you're doing anything, and click on new project application FY 2026 if you're a transition project or a new project. If you are a YHDP project that's transitioning from one component to another, you're going to want to click YHDP Replacement Project 2026. Steps to walk through to actually create your individual project. And then name your project using that name that was linked on slide 18. And then once you have created it, named it, you can go back and open it. And this is what the menu looks like before, with the before starting heading here. And I just want to note for you all, some of you might want to, once you create it, look through the whole thing before you start filling it out, right? But that is not the way eSNAPS is structured. You have to complete all through 1K. And once that's completed, the rest of the forms in the application will open up for you all. So you haven't necessarily done anything wrong if you're not seeing all the questions that I'm going to show you on the upcoming slides. You have to complete through SF424B in order for the whole application to open up. I did link here for you all a sample new project application. It's a PDF of an application from a former year that we've updated and put instructions in red about what happens on every screen. It's super detailed and has lots of information. So I encourage you to use that as a resource if it's helpful for you all. It has prompts about how to complete things, things like that. Congressional district and dates, I just want to highlight for this screen, update your start and end dates for new non-transitioning projects. So new is what we've been calling them in our office. I would put the start date as July 1st, 2027, and then a year later is when the end date would be. For transition grants, they're going to have the same operating year, right? So just make sure that they start in 2027 and end in 2028. For your narratives, 2B is an experience narrative. So this is where you're going to want to ensure that applicants and subrecipients demonstrate the capacity and experience to carry out project activities and administer funds, right? So review and use the prompts on the sample new project template and the instructions document. right? There are several components that it asks you to fill out. So some of the prompts are, how do you work with and address the target population? How do you identify how have you in the past, because it's experience, right? How have you identified housing and supportive service needs in the past? How have you developed and implemented relevant programs, systems, and services in the past? How have you identified and secured matching funds from a variety of sources? And how have you managed basic organization basic organization operations, including financial accounting systems, right? So best practices, I would include my achievements for similar projects. Like, so be really concrete. How many participants have exited to permanent housing in the past? How many have increased employment income? Include prior transitional housing experience or successful exits from participants within 24 months. Including details about amounts and types. Again, like I would put specific amounts and types of funds leveraged in the past, and people have given the sources as well, and that's a good idea to do. Include structures for ensuring programmatic and fiscal oversight, quality assurance, and compliance. What are your systems for those things?
I just want to say real quick, Shannon. So, this 50% of folks exiting with employment income, right? That is the administration's performance measure that they are looking for. If your employment outcomes are not up to that level, then I probably would not include, like if you've got employment outcomes that are much lower than that, I probably would not include that as in the experience section, right? So include outcomes when they reflect performance that is aligned with what the administration is looking.
Thank you. I just want to flag for everyone on the 3A project details screen. Is this new application requesting to transition from eligible renewal that was awarded? So if you're transitioning to TH program, then you want to say yes to that. If you're a different kind of new program, DV bonus or COC bonus program, no is the answer to that question. And then if you do click yes for transitioning projects, a table is going to pop up where you're going to have to fill in information from the grant that is transitioning, right? So they want the grant number, the start date, the expiration date, and the component type of that. And then also, if you are a grant that's transitioning, you have to attach a copy of for most of the programs, it'll be FY 2024, the most recent eSNAPS project application on screen 7A, which is the attachment screen. For transitioning projects, you'll also have to demonstrate a realistic plan to wind down your old component and ramp up the new TH component. How are you going to phase out the permanent housing that currently exists and transition to the TH, the transitional housing model? How are you going to protect the permanent housing tenants from homelessness and help them seek alternate housing? And then the timeline should show that the program is going to be fully operational, fully transitioned to transitional housing within 12 months of this new grant period.
So just one thing here on 7B to be aware of, right? Don't say that your plan is that you're going to move all of your current permanent support or rapid rehousing tenants into transitional housing, right? That is not the plan that they are looking for. They are looking for you to assist people, as much as possible to move on to other unassisted permanent housing as necessary, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can qualify people who meet homeless criteria for your new TH, but that should not be the plan that you are describing here.
Project description narratives, again, align narratives with HUD priorities, as we're kind of saying throughout here. So it's important to think about how you're going to say things in light of the administration's goals, priorities, and we know that there are practices that we've had for years that they're not in favor of anymore. So housing first being one of them, right? So we used to have it as a requirement to include housing first in the narrative. Now it's a requirement to not have that in the narrative. So the CT Boss team that has put together this document, language adjustments to align with HUD's priorities. So there's disfavored terms in there, and then alternate terms in there that you might consider using. So please take a look at that. And we think it will be helpful for you as you think about how you're going to describe your project and what you're doing here. Describe service participation requirements. Describe how the project will assess service needs, create a service plan for each participant, and provide individualized services resulting in engagement at least 20 hours per week in services, activities, or employment.
Is that per individual?
20 hours per week per individual, yes.
Just want to be clear.
There are exceptions to that. It's in an upcoming slide, I think. But the 20 hours per week employment can be considered in that 20 hours. If the person has a disability, that's an exception. I think it's in an upcoming slide. There are more exceptions. I'm not sure the age. It's 62 or 65 or older.
It's 62 and it's in an upcoming slide.
Thank you. So for your project description narrative, some more things to incorporate. Describe how the project will improve participant and COC outcomes. So again, Lauren, I think these 50%, that's the administration's goals, right? 50% exit, yes. With employment, income, exits to permanent housing, demonstrate a plan for at least 50% to exit. So these are things that you can say you're going to plan for and how you're going to get people to those goals, right? Your plan to minimize people's length of time homeless. And as it stands now, when a person is in transitional housing, they are still considered homeless. So make their stay as brief as possible, but it's allowable to be in the program for 24 months and then exit them to permanent housing, and preferably permanent housing that is unsubsidized. How are you going to provide, again, access to treatment and recovery as a means to improve self-sufficiency and decrease unsheltered homelessness throughout the COC, improve public safety, and provide trauma-informed care? There are questions specifically on supportive services. Describe how your participants will be assisted to obtain and maintain permanent housing. And again, how are you going to do that within 24 months? Prioritization of self-sufficiency. Describe assistance with education, employment, training, and treatment to enable increases in earned income. Include items of how you're going to achieve this from the 20 hours of services, and describing how you're going to obtain and maintain permanent housing. And then there's a question asking you to describe your plan to coordinate and integrate with mainstream health, social service, and employment programs. I was on a webinar where some participants pointed out that this seems contrary to their goal of having people to maintain their self-sufficiency without attachment to resources. But it's been a question, and I imagine it'll still be a question in the new project application. So when you're answering this question, include specific examples of local resources and partners that you work with, especially those partners that you use for working with substance use disorder and mental health treatment. Describe how staff will assist with connections, how you'll help complete applications, how you'll work with providing access to transportation or providing the transportation as appropriate in order to gain these connections and maintain these connections, if possibly even after they exit your program, like employment services and social services. This slide I'm going to leave here for reference. It's just how to complete the supportive services chart that you're going to see here, and how answering non-partner or partner is directed to you by the application. This is another slide that's here for your reference, housing type and location. It's just making sure parts of the application in 4B match other parts, 5A and 5B, and how all are supposed to reflect the maximum capacity of the program at a single point in time.
Shannon, let's just spend a minute on that because I feel like we have time and that's a place where people often get tripped up. So what we often see is that you've got total units in 4B that don't match the total number of households that you have in 5A, right? So units in 4B should match households in 5A. And then the same thing for beds in 4B should almost always match people in 5B, right? So, which is the subpopulation section of the populations part of the application. So make sure when you're doing your applications that you're double checking so that those things match.
Thank you. All right, I think I'm going to pass it over to Liz now. Liz, are you? Oh, am I still sharing my screen?
It would be nice if you could hear me. Sorry about that. So we're talking about funding requests. So transition grants are considered new grants. I'm sorry, let's look at this. I have to get my notes here. Transition grants are considered new projects. So remember, you're going to complete new project applications. You're going to look at, depending on what you're applying for. So transition grants have to do reallocation. New transitional housing grants from RFP are considered a COC bonus. New DV transitional housing grants from the RFP are considered DV bonus. You're going to answer the question if requesting initial term of more than 12 months, transitional grants are going to say no, and the others may request up to 18 months. Okay.
So I just want to say real quick, so you want to think about if you are not a transition grant, you're actually applying for a new grant, whether it makes sense to request more than 12 months. Often we see delays in project startup, right? And so it gives you more time to be able to spend down the money, some delays in project startup and still being able to fully spend. And we know that this administration is very focused on spending. So please consider that as an option if you think there might be some project startup delays.
Great. Thank you. That makes sense. Okay, so we're talking about match. Match equals 25% of the total assistance requested, except for leasing costs. So let's just do some quick examples. Example one is a leasing project. So there's $100,000 in leasing that you're going to take out. There's 25,000 operating, 25,000 services, 15 admin. And so your requirement is 25% of the 65,000 because you remove that 100,000. In example two, this is rental assistance. We have 100,000 in rental assistance, 25,000 in services, 12,500 in admin, and our match requirement is 25,000 of the total amount, 34,375. You'll hear us, we say this all the time, please don't commit more than 25% because HUD monitors on the entire amount, and it's hard enough sometimes to figure out the match and find all your sources, so just do 25%. And remember that if you have a in-kind match, you have to attach the MOU for the third party confirming the commitment. And you'll also hear us say, if you have to do an in-kind match, you may just have to, but we prefer, everybody likes cash, right? So we prefer a cash match if possible. And I know a few providers have reached out to me to talk about match. Feel free to call us and we're happy to brainstorm with you. We could do 2 hours on match here. We're not going to. So there is a link to let you know what else you can learn about match. So
I do want to say that know that if
Yep.
you're going to do in kind, the documentation requirements are much more onerous. So
Yep.
that's the reason not to do in kind. It's not just because we don't like it, right? It's like it's hard for you if you're going to do in kind. So and the recapture risks are much bigger for in kind match because there's so many opportunities to mess up the documentation. So that's why we say please do cash match if you can.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so attachments. Shannon already mentioned you're going to want to make sure you have all your attachments here. So not-for-profit documentation, you need to have that for projects with nonprofit subrecipients. Third party in-kind match, we just talked about that. Replacement reserves, if that's applicable. Your NICRA, your indirect cost rate approved, if applicable. If you have a YHD match waiver letter, and I think some of you do, so you get this from Katie Durand at DOH. And for transition grants, Lauren mentioned this, you're going to need a copy of the most recently submitted project application. Or Shannon mentioned that, sorry. Okay, and you're going to just want to make sure as you look at your submission summary, you don't want to see anything that says incomplete. Incomplete's no good because you can't submit. So you just want to make sure that everything it has been completed and has a date or has no input required. Okay. So Lauren was talking a little bit about this. We want to make sure that you have everything that you need. So please use this. And I know Shannon said this too at the beginning. We're hoping that the slide deck is helpful as a reference. So please go back to it when you finish your application and before you submit it to us. Take a look at these questions we're asking you. So does 2B include all the required information? And you can go back to slide 31. Did you correctly indicate whether this is a transition grant? Does your project description align with the HUD priorities? So we have that listed on a few different slides and the TH quality threshold requirements that Shannon just went through. You want to make sure that 4A emphasizes self-sufficiency, services to increase employment income, and linkages to substance use disorder and mental health treatment. And those are outlined in 36. And then Lauren just went through this because it's a common error. Do units, beds in 4B match people, households in 5A and 5B? Also, did you request the correct type of funding? Did you commit the required match and not overcommit? So remember, we're staying at 25%. Did you attach all the required documents in 7A, which we just went through? Throughout the application is language aligned with HUD policies, and you can check that on slide 34. And are there any incomplete sections, which we just talked about, and you can look at slide 41 for that. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about, we've been talking about transitional housing, but we're going to talk more about transitional housing. And so for some of you, this may be new. For some of you, you're doing it. And then for some of you, you did it a long time ago. And so we wanted to talk about some of the basic tenets of transitional housing. And then as you can see throughout everything, we're weaving through what HUD's priorities are because we really want people to put forth successful applications. So HUD considers transition grants to be new projects. We talked about that. So what are you allowed to do with these transition grants? You can reconfigure the budget. So you can add line items. You can eliminate budget line items. You can move funds along the BLI. You can change the number of households being served. But if you do that, you will need a transition. Oh, you're going to need a transition plan. Lauren had talked about this for all the existing PH tenants. If you're reducing the number, can change the households, you can change the sub-pops being served, and you can combine grants. So there's a lot you can do, and you can see the little visual trying to turn what seems like a problem into an opportunity. This is the timeline that you can see we have, unfortunately, some to be announced. So no e-snaps, which we're distraught about, but hopefully it will open soon. New project applications are going to be due in Zengen either July 6th or 1 week after e-snaps opens, whichever one is later, because we want you to have some time to do that. You're going to submit a new project application in e-snaps, but we can't tell you when that is yet. Because eSnaps isn't open. And also what we do is generally we ask you to submit if you can within 3 business days of edits being given to you, but sometimes we need to do a back and forth. So just know that you will eventually submit a new project application in eSnaps. Hopefully, awards will be announced in December 2026. That is the mandate. Well, awarded grants start in calendar year 2027 on the day after renewal grant ends. 12-month award, unless you opt, as Lauren had mentioned, for the 18-month. Permanent housing projects closed out by the grant end date in calendar year 2028, and the project renews in the 2027 competition. Okay. So what is transitional housing? Again, many of you know this, and we just want to talk through some of the concepts. Again, what I'm going to talk about, and I'll tell you when I'm talking about best practices, and then I'm going to talk about how we're trying to make sure that we always have best practices, but we're listening to what HUD has to say in terms of their priorities. So as we've been talking about, you have up to 24 months. But the goal really is to get folks out as quickly as possible. As Shannon mentioned, folks in transitional housing are still considered unhoused, and we want to move them on as quickly as possible. We want them to access housing, which means we want them to do an exit plan within the first 30 days they get there. And we want something outlined that says, how are you going to work together to locate the housing as quickly as possible? And then we will remind you again that HUD is super focused on unsubsidized housing. So helping folks access unsubsidized housing as quickly as possible. We're going to increase income, connections to housing, resources, and skills for stability. Increasing income is huge. As Lauren and Shannon just mentioned, 50%, the outcome of 50% folks being employed, it's hard, but that's the goal, and that's the system performance goal for HUD. So you're going to hear us talking about it. I know that you all work very, very hard, and I also know that it's really been challenging for folks. So we're happy to, as we move on, try to provide resources and trainings on how to make that happen. But as we talk about income, employment just is pertinent in that mix. In terms of a service program, we're going to look at assertive engagement. So that emphasizes persistence, flexibility, meeting people where they are, and always respecting folks' autonomy and choices. We're going to have a recovery practice, a growth mindset, so people can recover and grow, lead fulfilling lives, even when they're still experiencing the challenges of mental health symptoms, substance use, trauma impacts, and housing instability. We're going to environmentalize, not my word, but I like this idea, housing, which means that everything we do is going to be about housing. We're going to do housing focused case management. We're going to do housing focused service plans so that we're always talking about the next step, which is to get to housing. There are population specific services. So we're going to make sure that if you're serving folks who are survivors of DV, you have services specifically for them, for youth, for folks living with substance use disorders, veterans, so that when you're creating service plans and you're thinking about who you're serving, you are matching the appropriate services to those populations. In terms of the lease, we're always going to use the lease or the occupancy agreement to help teach tenancy skills and to use that as a tool moving ahead in their housing. So we can't ask folks to follow rules they don't know about. So as soon as folks get into housing with you all, we want to make sure that you sit down with whatever you have, a lease or a program agreement, and go through all of the rules so that they know what the expectations are. We always want to separate the roles of the case manager with the property manager or the landlord, whatever the situation is, because we want to preserve the relationship of the case manager with the participant. And the case manager with the participant is always going to be the advocate, the service provider, but not the rule enforcer. So if we need a rule enforcer, we need the landlord or the property manager to play that role. Okay. So some transitional housing goals. Again, you have 24 months, but we want folks to get out as quickly as possible. So I'll repeat that the hope is that there is an exit plan done within the first 30 days of entering the program and that it's reviewed at least monthly. Again, we're going to increase income and savings. So when we talk about income again, we're always going to be looking towards employment. I hate using the word budgeting because we always talk about budgeting people with very little money, but money management and how folks can try to save some money. so that they can have something in the bank when they move on. We're going to always teach skills and manage housing and resources. So, what do we need for folks to be doing to be successful at housing? It's going to look different for each person, individualized. What are the barriers? Is it paying rent? Is it complying with the lease? And what do you need? Do you need childcare? Do you need to access mental health services? So we're going to do that to make sure that folks can be successful in housing and achieve their goals. We're going to help them define meaningful goals so that they're motivated to achieve them. And again, we're always going to be working on housing focused service plans. Okay. So who are we serving? These are the target populations. So transitional housing, folks in a life stage transition, young youth, young folks, folks in recovery from substance use, DV survivors, folks exiting incarceration, recovering from a medical condition, folks with a mental illness, but some of that we have a note here, caveats, folks who we feel will be successful in transitional housing. And if they need a higher level of care, this might not be the place for them. We're serving families, but we always want to make sure we're not pathologizing. We're focusing on income, and we're not providing unnecessary services. So sometimes we think in family programs, folks provide parenting skills. There's nothing wrong with a parenting class, but it certainly you would never want it to make mandatory, or you would never want to imply that because folks are unhoused, they are unfit parents or they need extra help in that domain. And then transitioning projects may shift your populations over time through attrition. So people are going to exit, and then maybe you can look to a new population type as you have space in your program.
I just wanted to clarify one quick thing on this,
Sure.
Liz.
Yeah.
So our understanding is that I believe it was HUD-TA told DOH that people who are exiting institutions, right, are not eligible under category 2. So I'm not sure whether or not, and I'll connect with Katie on this, whether or not DOH has that in writing from HUD. But if you are thinking of serving that population, people exiting incarceration, I would not do that unless you've got an AAQ from HUD that indicates that they are eligible. You're going to want to have something in writing from HUD indicating that they are eligible. If you don't hear back from them by the time you have to submit your application, which seems very likely because we can say that we are not quickly getting answers from HUD on the questions that we are submitting, then I wouldn't list that population specifically in your project application.
Thanks, Lauren.
Can I have a question real quick? If we are applying for a transitional grant from our existing supportive housing grant, would our population stay the same?
So in the short term, if you've got to transition people, maybe, right? But in the long term, probably not. Because if you have a PSH grant, like that, the population that grant was supposed to be serving is not going to be a good fit for transitional housing. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that more in a minute.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay. So as you all know, transitional housing can look very different in different places. So we can have a congregate single site project. You might have semi-private rooms, you might have private rooms, you might have a dormitory. Sometimes there are sleeping cubicles. And just remember that if you're using rental assistance, you have to have a bathroom and a kitchen, or a waiver saying that you don't have to have the bathroom or kitchen because you have the waiver. And I think we're working with some folks on this. Maybe it's scattered site apartments throughout the community. They can be master leased with occupancy agreements with the participants, or you might have individual leases with sublease to participants. And the tenants can assume the lease at the end of the term and transition in place, which is really great if that's at all possible. Okay. So this is a HUD thing. There's a transitional housing specific quality threshold review. So there are 8 points up for grabs. You need to get at least 6 of them. And so we'll just walk really quickly through this. So you will provide, and a partner agency will provide supportive services to assist folks obtaining and maintaining housing. that there's prior TH experience or success helping people exit homelessness within 24 months or have a plan to help them exit within 24 months. They have a plan to ensure this keeps coming up, right? 50% exit to positive destination and with employment. And that the project is supplemented with other public-private resources, which you'll have through your match, hopefully, and that the average cost per household is reasonable. So remember, these are 8 points, and you have to get 6 of them. And we're going to talk in detail a little bit about how you can fulfill some of the service requirements. Okay. Oh. So you're gonna need to describe how the project will assess service needs and provide individual services resulting in engagement of at least 20 hours per week in services, activities, and remember employment is included. So here are some examples: case management, counseling, treatment, volunteering, work therapy, education, job training, and community building activities. We have a link to a sample service schedule. So if it seems like this is impossible to do, we've made it a little bit more possible to do. So check that out. And you're going to create service plans for every participant, which would include what services are provided as specific as you can with when, how, whom, participant goals and strategies with target achievement dates. And remember, we're always focusing on housing. We're also going to focus on how to improve health and wellness, employment, income, financial stability, and self-sufficiency.
So I just want to say that projects that do not pass this quality threshold will not be funded by HUD, right? So when you're doing your application, you really want to go back through the application and say, and we definitely recommend that you design your application in a way that you think you're going to get all 8 points, right? Because if you design your application in a way where you're only shooting to get 6 of those 8 points and you miscalculated something or HUD interpret something differently than how you thought they would, you're not going to get funded, right? So you want to put forward an application that you feel confident can get all 8 of the points that Liz just went through.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. That's helpful. I know Lauren just went through that exercise with a project to score it, and that's always really helpful. And that you want to use this, as your guide, right? So as you're writing it up, you want to go through and have use this as your list and your guide. Thanks, that's helpful. So there are rules to this, to the exclusions to the 20-hour service requirement. So folks we talked about this before, over age 62, people with a handicapped or developmental disability. The definition is much more restrictive than the disability definition used for PSH. So you definitely want to look into that, and excludes folks who qualify for PSH, some people with HIV, and some whose primary diagnosis is substance use disorder. Yeah, sorry. So remember, HUD considers transition grants to be new projects, but they work differently than a regular new project application. So the recipient of this can only be the recipient of the renewal being reallocated is the only eligible applicant. So that works for all of you. The operating start date of the transition project is the day after the end of the grant term for the expiring renewal, which this is really important because you don't have a gap in funding. So that's really huge for this. For transition grants reallocated from more than one project, the operating start date of the transition grant date is the day after the earliest expiring grant term, which is also good. Transition grant required to fully transition to the new component by the end of the first grant term, unless 18-month grant term is disallowed. And the amount requested cannot exceed the annual renewal amount of the reallocated grant.
So I just want to say, if you've got more than one renewal project that you are considering consolidating into a single transitional housing transition project, please let us know that so that we are not chasing you for multiple applications that you are not intended to submit. So this is an opportunity if you've got programs that you want to consolidate to do that. But you'll need to let our team know.
Thanks, Lauren. All right, so we've been alluding to the HUD performance measures. So 50% of folks exit with employment income, 50% of folks exiting to permanent housing, 20% of exits to unsubsidized housing. And again, we're going to keep hearing HUD prioritizing exits to unsubsidized housing. Less than 8% return to homelessness in 2 years, and reducing the time homeless. And remember, transitional housing counts as being homeless. So we want to move folks out as quickly as possible. So who is eligible? So again, you're going to hear us say this over and over, right? HUD really expects folks to assist permanent housing tenants to move into unassisted housing, unsubsidized housing. And then the pathways for current permanent housing participants to be able to qualify for transitional housing is under Category 2, imminent risk of homelessness, or Category 4, fleeing or attempting to flee DV. We're going to give you more information about this and have some tools and guidance. But right now, what you can look at is the HUD guidance. There's a link right there on what it looks like to have permanent housing participants move into TH and what that eligibility looks like. I think I might hand it over to you, Lauren, or not yet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. So we want to make sure that we leave time for questions at the end. So I'm not going to cover all of the slides in this next set. Some of them you'll have for your reference. But before I jump in, does anybody have questions now? I'm not seeing anything in the chat or any hands up, but just wanted to pause to see. Amanda.
Thanks. I just had a question about like a lot of the rapid rehousing grants are DOH as the recipient, right? With multiple subrecipients. So how are we approaching it this year, given that this is different than it's historically been?
So DOH will still be the recipient for the transition grant, and the subrecipients will not be responsible for, and someone on my team will jump in if I get this wrong. The subrecipients will not be responsible for doing the applications, right? So if you are currently are a subrecipient on a big statewide DOH grant, our team will work with DOH to do the project application.
Okay, because I think historically we have done part of the application or helped with one of them. So that's why I was asking.
We may need information from you in order to do the application. So our team will reach out for any information that we need from you to do the application. And Shannon, please jump in if I'm wrong.
Thank you.
That sounds right to me. Yes.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk some more about best practices for transitional housing program design and some ideas really for how we might together make the best of this, very difficult situation that we find ourselves in, and use it as an opportunity to design transitional housing programs that are actually effective and work for the people that we're serving. So, Liz just went through the HUD performance measures. And so right out of the gate, when you're thinking about designing your new transitional housing program, you're going to want to design with those performance measures in mind, right? So exiting with employment income, exiting to permanent housing, including unsubsidized housing, reducing returns to homelessness, and reducing the length of time homeless, right? So to accomplish these things, you're obviously going to need case management that is laser focused on getting people into permanent housing at the end of their stay in transitional housing and getting people employed, because they want 50% of your folks to exit with employment income. So we know, right, and I think, Holly, you started to ask this question a minute ago, right? We know that a focus on employment income may not be the best fit for your current participants, right? If you're transitioning a PSH project and you've got a lot of very vulnerable disabled folks, employment income is not going to be probably for many of them the right path. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So, and then I think Liz mentioned this earlier, we will at some point develop an operations guide for transitional housing. We haven't had much transitional housing in the COC for many, many years, so we don't currently have one. We will after the NOFO is over, assuming that this all moves forward and is not stopped by the courts, we will develop that. But in the meantime, we wanted to put forward, some of our thinking about what best practices are in transitional housing. And so, because it's meant to be very short term, right? You want to have a housing exit plan for everyone very, soon after they enter the project. So probably within 30 days, you want to have that housing exit plan, and you want to update that plan frequently because it is such a short stay. So it's not going to be like PSH where you only update the plan every 6 months. This is transitional housing. You want to be updating those plans. Monthly. And again, 2 years is the maximum stay in transitional housing, but the goal should be to help move people out much more quickly. Since that assistance is going to be quite time limited, the whole program should really be designed around teaching people skills and helping to get people set up so that they can manage their own housing and their own care moving forward, because your team is only going to be involved with them for a much shorter time, much more similar to how we do rapid rehousing currently than how we have done PSH, which is different. So the reality is that, can you move to the next slide? So the reality is that transitional housing is likely not going to be a good fit for some of the people that are in the projects that you're transitioning, right? So if you've got a lot of older adults, if you've got a lot of very vulnerable people with, very serious, severe, serious and persistent mental illness, if you've got a lot of folks with other kinds of chronic disabilities that are not going to get better, then transitional housing is not going to be a great fit for those folks. So assuming the courts don't intervene again in the medium term, right, what we're going to have to do is figure out who is most in need of permanent supportive housing, the people who are living in your programs currently that are now transitioning to transitional housing, which of those people are most in need of permanent supportive housing, and making transfers, right, into the remaining existing permanent supported housing units. Some of those people, we're not going to probably have enough units available in permanent supportive housing. And so some of those people that are not really a great fit for transitional housing are going to end up in transitional housing anyway. And then the work with those folks will really be on, making sure that they have all their documents that they need in order to be able to transition to permanent supportive housing as soon as a unit becomes available for them. And then, as Liz really talked about, over the longer term, you're going to want to shift your population to focus on people who are in a life stage transition for whom the transitional model makes more sense, right? So you want to be thinking about the populations that Liz reviewed on slide 49, which of those have the greatest unmet need in your CAN and which you're going to target, right? So are you going to focus on people in the early stages of recovery? Are you going to focus on people who are recovering from some kind of medical condition? And then you're going to want to develop partnerships for specialized services that match your population, right? And in particular, you are all going to need to have employment services because of that very aggressive employment target. So you are going to want to be linking people to community colleges and to certificate training programs that are going to be able to pay a living wage so that at the end of the 2 years, they can afford housing on their own. Clearly, if you're going to focus on folks with a substance use disorder, you're going to need to have really good linkages to treatment. If you're working with the DV population, you're going to need really good linkages to legal services. If you're focusing on people who are recovering from some kind of medical condition, you're going to want to have really good healthcare partnerships. And we need to keep the costs low in the projects as much as we can so that we don't lose too many units. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But the goal should really be to try to partner and link people to existing services in the community rather than to try to provide every service that people need internally through your project, because that will be much, much more expensive. And the more we spend on services, the less we're going to have available for units, right? And if we dramatically reduce our number of units across the COC, we're going to see more homelessness, which we don't want to do. So, and then, of course, you're obviously going to want to think about safety and security when you're building your concept of your project model and then your budget. So certainly, if you've got a congregate site that you're thinking about using, particularly if it's a bigger site, you're going to want to have on-site coverage, security coverage. You're probably going to want to have some cameras. And even if it's a scattered site model, you're going to want to make sure that you've got after hours staffing coverage to handle safety concerns and emergencies that might emerge in the program. Kathy, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, if this is so helpful, but also a little bit confusing. So if the rental assistance that we might need to support the transitional housing is now with ACT or someplace else, how does that factor in? Or will that all be the DEMAS subgrants, so we don't need to think about that?
So we'll talk a little bit about using leasing versus using rental assistance in a minute. I suspect many organizations are going to want to use leasing instead of rental assistance. But if you do decide that you're going to go the rental assistance model, then DOH would be the recipient, right? They would contract, with whoever they contracted with. Currently, it's ACT. To do the rental assistance administration, you assuming that it is not part of one of those big statewide grants, right? You would still be doing the project application, right? So if you are currently a nonprofit recipient of a rapid rehousing program, you want to transition to transitional housing, but you want DOH to be the applicant, you're still going to need to do that project application. So I don't know if I answered your question, Kathy. I said a lot of words.
But in the transitional, if we're transitioning, can we include leasing in our?
Yes.
Okay, but if our total grant now does not include the leasing money because we're just getting the services money, will there be some kind of adjustment there?
So you are able, this is a brand new project, right? So you're able to take the amount of money that you currently get in your renewal and completely reconfigure the budget. So you can take money that's currently in services and move it to leasing. You could take money that's currently in rental assistance and move it to leasing and or services. It's open season on what you do with your budget, right? The caveat, right, is that we want as a community, as much as we can, not to radically reduce the number of units that we're making available to people. Although we certainly understand that we are going to lose some units here, right? Because you're not going to be able to do that. Like, it's a different model and you're going to have to think about your program differently. And in many cases, and we're going to get more in the details on this in a minute, you're going to have to reduce the number of units that you have in order to be able to fund more services and or be able to fund an operating line if you're going to use leasing. Okay. All right. So next slide. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is a list of the core service categories that you want to consider including as part of your transitional housing design. So as you are, thinking about your program model and your budget, if this is helpful, it's here for you and you can refer to it. Couple things I did want to say is that not everything that is on this slide is an eligible COC expense, right? So we'll look in a minute about how you know what's eligible and not eligible. But for example, here it talks about recreational activities. That's not an eligible COC expense. So if you're going to do that, you've got to pay for it through a different source. You also cannot use your matching money. Remember, you've got to only use your matching money also on COC eligible expenses. The other thing that's listed here that is not going to be an eligible expense are, things like community events, right? Those are probably not eligible expenses. Clothing and household supplies, unless they are explicitly part of some kind of life skills training, those are not going to be eligible COC expenses. Next slide.
Oops, sorry.
Yep, one back. So again, I'm not going to go through all of this. We're just keeping it here as a reference so that you can consult with it if it's helpful while you're designing these projects. There is at the top of this slide a resource that I just wanted to point out. It's from a youth transitional housing program in Montana, and it's a participant handbook that we think does a great job of framing a low barrier, person-centered, trauma-informed approach to transitional housing. So if it's useful to you, please look at it. Next slide. So these are some best practices for staffing your new transitional housing program. So obviously, you're going to need to think about, how you're going to staff the supportive services side. So you're going to need to have, some kind of program director or coordinator, right? That person can be on your supportive services budget. You're going to need to have somebody who's directly supervising your case managers, right? That person can be on your supportive services budget. You're obviously going to need to have some case managers or similar title, whatever you call those folks at your agency. And we are recommending a caseload size that is pretty small because these are intensive projects that are meant to help people be prepared to exit, increase income and exit to housing quickly. And so we're suggesting caseloads of 1 to 10 to 1 to 15. And then depending upon the specific target population that you are going to be looking in the medium to long term to transition to, right, you're going to want to have some other specialty positions. I think all projects are going to want to be thinking about whether a specialty housing navigator position makes sense, right? Somebody who's really specialized, knows a lot about the rental market and really well equipped, has those relationships with landlords, can help people get alternative housing quickly. Everybody is probably going to want to have, either provide or link to, some really intensive employment services. And so you might have an employment specialist on your team. Clearly, if you are working with folks that have high medical need, you might need to have some nursing resources on your team and or other kinds of licensed clinicians. If you're working with folks in early stages of recovery, you might have a drug and alcohol counselor, et cetera. And then on the operating side, right, to the extent that you are going to be using leasing dollars, which again, we're going to talk about in a minute, and or you've got some kind of congregate facility, you're certainly going to want to be thinking about security and front desk coverage, and you're going to want to be thinking about who's doing the cleaning, who's fixing things and maintaining things in the units, who's doing apartment unit turnover, etc. And those are all things that you can fund on an operating budget line item if you are using the leasing budget line item, but not if you are using the rental assistance budget line item, which takes us to the next slide. So as is always the case, your COC budget will include what your housing related expenses are. So you're either going to probably do leasing or rental assistance. If you are a nonprofit, HUD TA has recently made clear that nonprofit recipients are not eligible to administer rental assistance, right? So if you are a nonprofit and you are the direct grantee, you're not a subrecipient of DOH, you're going to have to figure out, are you going to stay with rental assistance or are you going to move to leasing? And we'll talk about that more on the next slide. If you're going to use the leasing model, then you can also have an operating budget line item. If you've got a congregate project, you can also just have an operating budget line item, right? You don't need to have leasing or rental assistance. You could just use the operating budget line item. As has always been the case, you may not combine the operating budget line item with the rental assistance budget line item. And this area on the budget for most projects is going to be where you put your security and your like kind of property management type staff, right? Maintenance, repair, etc. will be on the operating budget line item in most cases.
I just wanted to flag that there's one caveat to that: nonprofits may not administer rental assistance. The special activity, it's a special activity for YHDP programs alone. You can request that special activity to have a nonprofit administer rental assistance.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah.
All right. So where are we? So all of this means, right?
I'm sorry, there's a hand raised.
Yep.
Margaret?
Can you go back a slide?
Yeah.
I'm a little confused, and you said it sort of fast. With the leasing or rental assistance, nonprofits may not administer rental assistance. But you said if you're receiving funds for that program through DOH, then you can. Is that what you said?
Well, DOH is the recipient, right? So DOH is able as a government agency to administer rental assistance. DOH is also able to contract an entity to administer rental assistance on their behalf. So for example, DOH currently contracts either ACT to administer rental assistance in rapid rehousing and CCADV to administer rental assistance in DV bonus housing. So DOH, as an eligible rental assistance administrator, they can opt to contract with another entity to administer that rental assistance on their behalf.
Okay, I think I'll reach out to someone after this.
Okay.
My questions.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
I actually want to make sure that we get through all the slides. So I'm going to ask if we can hold questions until we get through the slides, and then we'll stay on. I can also stay on at the end for a little bit to make sure we get to everyone's questions. All right. So given all of this, you are likely going to need to reconfigure your program to align both with the HUD performance measures that we've been talking about and with a target population that makes sense for transitional housing. So you may need to increase your supportive services budget line item to be able to get to this 20-hour per week target. Now remember, you don't have to provide 20 hours a week of services to everyone, but you have to either link them or make available directly through your project so that they can engage in services for at least 20 hours per week. So you're probably going to need to increase you may need to increase your supportive services budget line item. You're probably going to need, particularly if you're going to do leasing, to add an operating budget line item where one doesn't exist. So you can't increase your total budget. That's a restriction that, from HUD, like a transition grant can only be the same renewal amount as the renewal that is reallocating. but you can move money across lines without limit. So if you need more service dollars or you need to add an operating line, you can reduce the number of units and the number of households that you're going to be able to serve in order to be able to do that. But as I said earlier, you want to be mindful that a massive reduction in our units across the COC is going to increase homelessness. So please only reduce your units to the extent that you think it's necessary to fund the level of services and the operating costs that you're going to have. And again, consider partnering with existing service providers in the community and leveraging as much existing services as you can so that we can hold on to as many of our units as possible. So this slide goes a little bit more into detail on what's going to be on your supportive services budget line item. As is always the case in these new project applications to HUD, if you're going to have staff time, which you will, you're going to need to include their title, the number of FTEs, and then a quantified description of any additional costs that you have on the supportive services budget that are not staff. So for example, if you're going to fund bus tickets, you want to say you're going to buy 100 bus tickets at $5 each, right? So you need to have a description and a quantity for all expenses. You're going to put on your supportive services budget, your program director, your supervisor, your case managers. We are suggesting that, case management salaries be a minimum of $50,000. Hopefully, in some cases, you guys will be able to afford to have salaries even higher than that. And then this is also where you're going to include the specialty staff that we talked about on the previous slide. And then the costs of operating the service program also belong on the supportive services budget line item. So for example, if you've got materials that you need for life skills training, that goes on the supportive services budget line item. And the facility itself, right, like where your case management staff work, that goes on the supportive services budget line item. And then as I can't remember whether it was Shannon or Liz said, HUD, our team will, and then HUD will do an assessment for cost reasonableness to make sure that the project passes threshold review. Next slide. So these are the categories in detail of everything that is eligible on the supportive services budget line item. All this green text here is a link to the actual regulations on these. We've reviewed these before in fiscal training in detail. We are not going to have time to go through them all now, but when you are building your budget, please check the details that are linked here to be sure that you are only proposing eligible costs, right? So each of these things is defined in greater detail at the links provided here. And so you don't have to guess whether or not something is eligible. You can click on this link and determine whether or not it's eligible. And our team is also available to answer questions if you're not sure how to interpret the information directly from HUD. Next slide. This is the same thing, but for the operating budget line item. And again, when you're doing your operating budget, please click on these links to make sure that the things that you are proposing are eligible. There are a few things that I wanted to go through here that are places where people often get tripped up, right? You can, and you should probably, if you're going to use the leasing budget line item, budget money for maintenance and repair of the unit so that if there are damages, you are not on the hook for those damages, that you can repair those damages and that those are eligible expenses for HUD. Now you have to keep in mind that it's only an eligible expense if you as the leasee are responsible for that expense in accordance with the lease that you signed with the property owner, right? If the lease says that the property owner is responsible, right, then it's not an eligible expense. Also, on the operating budget line item, this is where you would put any security for the program. You cannot pay for security unless more than 50% of the units in the building are COC funded, right? So that's a place where people often get tripped up. And then this is one of the great things about using leasing instead of rental assistance. You can pay for furniture on the operating budget line item as long as that furniture stays with the unit, right? So you can't pay for furniture that the participant's going to take with them, but you can pay for furniture that's going to stay in the unit, and that includes mattresses. And then you can also pay for equipment, right? So microwaves, refrigerators, stoves, washers, dryers, etc., as long as those things are going to stay with the project and not go with the participant when they leave. All right, next slide. So, so as Shannon said earlier, there is an exception to this. So in general, nonprofits cannot administer rental assistance in transitional housing, but you can as a special activity if it's a YHDP grant, right? So if you are a nonprofit and you are currently the recipient of your own grant, and you have to transition to transitional housing, and you currently use the rental assistance budget line item, you've got two options, right? You can keep the grant and continue to be the recipient on the grant, and instead of using rental assistance, you can use leasing, and you'll get the FMR on the leasing budget line item, and in addition to that, you can also request operating, right? And like I said, if you're going to use leasing, you want to really think about adding an operating budget line item to cover any damages so that you are not on the hook for those damages and unable to fund them through your HUD budget. Your second option is that you could partner with an eligible rental assistance administrator and continue to use rental assistance. So we talked a minute ago about DOH being a possibility. Now, a huge caveat here is that if you are currently the recipient and you want to move to having DOH be the recipient, that cannot, under the HUD rules, be a transition grant, right? Because the recipient has to be the same from the renewal to the transition grant. So that means if you want DOH to become the applicant, there's a possibility that you'll have a gap in funding. Now, the earlier your operating start year is in the calendar year, right? Grants that start in March are going to have a much higher chance of having a gap in funding than grants that start later in the operating year. The last option, or part of option 2 here, is that PHAs are also eligible rental assistance administrators. So you could partner with a PHA. I think that's probably rough. I think it's going to be hard for you to find a willing PHA partner, but by all means, if you have one, that is also an option. All right, next slide. So this next set of slides hopefully help people to understand how the leasing arrangement is different in a leasing project than in a rental assistance project. So regardless of whether you're going to do this as rental assistance or as leasing, you must have either, in transitional housing, we really talk about occupancy agreements, right? So you must have either a lease, a sublease, or an occupancy agreement with an initial term of at least 1 month that is automatically renewable upon expiration unless one party has given notice to the other party. And you're going to have a maximum term of 24 months. Now, we do not suggest that you do occupancy agreements of 24 months in transitional housing, right? Because the goal is, this is not a 24-month program. The goal is for people to move on as quickly as possible. And so we want to be communicating that upfront to people. And so you're probably going to have occupancy agreements with terms of 3 months, right? Not 24 months. And then I think, as Liz covered earlier, there, because of this service participation requirements that HUD has put in place, you're going to need to also have that codified in a written agreement. And we have a sample that I believe was linked in the slides earlier for how you can do that. Next slide. So this slide shows the leasing arrangement in a rental assistance project. So this is what you are, most of you are used to. And you can continue to do this if you decide that you're going to continue to do rental assistance. So the lease, right? You've got a contract as the recipient or subrecipient. You've got a contract with the landowner that lays out the terms of the subsidy, right? And the landowner's responsibilities. Then the landowner, the property owner, and the participant have a lease, right? So your agency is not a party to that lease. The participant has a lease directly with the property owner. That's challenging, right, in a transitional housing model, because it's probably going to be hard for you to get leases directly with program participants from landlords, and it's going to be really hard to get leases of less than 12 months. And remember, in transitional housing, you don't need to have an initial 24-month lease. You want to have an initial of at least 1 month, right? So the more likely arrangement in transitional housing is the next slide. So that is using the COC leasing budget line item, right? So under that model, you as the recipient or the subrecipient of the COC funds lease a unit from the property owner, right? And then you sublease or really enter into an occupancy agreement, is the language that we would normally use in transitional housing, with your program participant, right? So the participant does not have a lease. It's a master leasing model. You lease from the owner, then you enter into an occupancy agreement with the program participant, right? And this is the arrangement, this leasing arrangement is what you need to have if you want to have an operating budget line item. Okay, next slide. So, so this is a list of things that you want to consider as you are designing your program. Obviously, as we said, you're going to want to think from the outset about what HUD's goals and performance measures are for these programs, and make sure that you are designing a program around those goals and outcome measures. You're obviously going to have to think about, is this going to be a scattered site or a site-based project? What your target population is going to be, longer term. And how many households and units you're going to be able to include in your budget, given all of the other expenses that you might not currently have in your budget. And then you're going to need to think about, are you going to own the units? Probably most of you don't have a building that you own that you're going to be able to just layer this program on. You're probably going to have to lease units. It's probably not going to be realistic, at least this year, for people to be thinking about developing units. And then, which budget line items are you going to use to support the housing costs? Is it going to be rental assistance, or is it going to be leasing? And if it is leasing, are you going to also have an operating budget line item? And then, what's your intended length of stay, right? Not 24 months. We don't want to put forward programs that the intended length of stay is 24 months. So, is it going to be a 3-month program, a 6-month program? How quickly are you going to be able to move people on? And then, of course, your staffing pattern. We talked a bunch about budget already. I mentioned earlier that we will create some policies in the form of an operating guide, but you're going to want to think about what policies you might need to have specifically at the agency level, and then how you are going to monitor your performance to make sure that you are meeting HUD's performance objectives. All right. So we're going to wrap up here, and then we're going to open it back up for questions. So, a lot of you have been around for a long time, and I think Shannon said this before, transitional housing is an old new model, right? It's an old model that, we had a lot of experience with in the past that has now resurfaced under the new administration. And our sincere hope is that, we are all making the best that we can of this very difficult and disruptive situation. And our hope is that we can learn from the mistakes of the past and design transitional housing programs that work better this time around. And so we know that transitional housing doesn't work well for all populations. So we want to try to target the populations that we've been talking about, right? People who are in a life stage transition, early stage of recovery, recovering from a medical condition, et cetera. We know one of the problems, decades ago when we were doing a lot of transitional housing was that the programs were wildly expensive and did not have great outcomes, right? So we want to try to avoid recreating that problem by partnering as much as we can with existing community-based services rather than having all of these services in-house, and by designing a program that at the outset is geared towards the two most critical things, right? Helping people to get a place quickly and helping people to increase their income so that they can afford that place once the assistance ends. So we don't want to create the transitional housing models that existed in the past, where it would be like, this very structured 24-month program where magically at the end of the 24 months, you were fixed, right? That is not what we are doing, right? We are trying to help people to increase their income and exit to permanent housing that they can afford. And so we're not designing two-year programs. We're designing programs that move people into housing as quickly as possible. And we want to make sure from the start, all of the supports are designed around that rapid exit to permanent housing. So I think the good news is that you all have experience doing rapid rehousing, right? So you all have learned from that experience about what works, and that learning is very applicable in this new environment. So these programs are gonna look a lot more like rapid rehousing than permanent supportive housing. I think the thing that is going to be really different is thinking about who we're going to enroll moving forward in transitional housing versus who we're going to try to get straight into one of the remaining permanent supportive housing units. And that's I think in coming months, right, that is a restructuring that we are all going to have to work on together. So before we go to questions, let me just quickly do the resource slides. So these are some additional resources. So HUD actually has some decent resources for helping you to navigate in eSNAP. So if you're not finding the answers that you need in these slides, these are some additional resources that you can check out. As Shannon said earlier, HUD has not yet posted the detailed instructions either for the YHDP replacement applications or for the general COC new project applications. So the links here are to the most recent instructions we have from HUD. We will send out updated links as soon as eSNAPS opens and HUD releases the updated guidance. And then we just updated the FAQ document that we had done explaining, hopefully, all of these changes and what it's going to look like. So that link is here. If we haven't already, we will also be sending that out by email. Here is a sample service agreement. I mentioned that a moment ago. So your projects are, you may have to attach this to your project application. We don't have that information yet, but we suspect you will have to take this sample and customize it for your program and then attach it to your new project application. This is an example of how you can get to that 20-hour service requirement that HUD has put in place. There's a sample weekly schedule that shows you how you can meet that requirement. We've got also linked here the things the language that you're going to want to look for in your project application and make sure you remove, right? You don't want to talk about housing first in your project application. You don't want to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion in your project application, right? So this document walks you through how to align your application to what HUD's current policy priorities are. And then this last link, I believe, and someone on our team will correct me if I am wrong, is the list of new projects that are transitioning and what the amount is that you are authorized to apply at.
It's transitioning and new projects, new TH interim housing projects that applied through the COC. Yeah.
Thank you, Shannon. Next slide is just our contact information. So,
if I may, I would like to clarify something before we open up to questions. There was a question earlier about rapid rehousing projects and with DOH being the recipient, like who would apply. So there are several large COC-wide DV project, I mean, not DV projects, rapid rehousing projects for which DOH is the applicant. And there are maybe 4 or 5, 6 subrecipients. So for those, DOH will take care of the application as they usually do and be in touch. And I see through the chat that Lee said she's going to schedule some meetings with providers on that. But there are also a few that for which DOH is the applicant, but there are 1 or 2 subrecipients. So if there are 1 or 2 subrecipients, those subrecipients are going to be the ones that are responsible for the application. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Shannon, it's Lee. So that would be like CCADB, CHR has done 0279 in the past. So just as we've always done in prior years, we would just ask the same process this year.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Questions. We've got about 10 minutes remaining. And as we said, we will stay on if we've not gotten to all the questions. So Kathy.
Do you have any guidance on the tenancy rights that go along with an occupancy agreement?
I don't. I'm sorry. We can look into it and get that information out as quickly as we can. Usually in tenant landlord law, there's a period of time, and once someone has lived in a place for that period of time, they establish tenancy rights. I don't know what that period of time is in Connecticut. I don't know if anyone from DOH or anyone else that's on the call knows the answer to that.
I know that there's a sample occupancy agreement for YHDP projects. Would it have that information in it?
I don't think that gets into like what the tenancy rights are, the legal tenancy rights that somebody might be able to establish. And
we'll look into it too, but this is one of the challenges. Like if it's a 3-month agreement and that gives somebody tenancy and you say you haven't complied, then they go to court, so we'll look into that too. But if you find out anything about that, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Sure. Kathy, I'm just going to be honest with you. We are probably not going to look into that until after the competition is over. Like we are jamming, trying to get the most.
We'll check with our counsel. Thank you.
The most competitive application forward so that we can hang on to as much of this money as possible. That is our number 1 priority. So,
any other questions?
Really?
I'm not seeing any hands up.
Or if questions. Hopefully we haven't just totally confused you.
There's a question in the chat. Hartford Police Department will not remove people, including from shelter, after 30 days unless there's violence in the program.
So I think that person is just responding to Kathy's question about how the Hartford PD interprets tenancy rights in shelter.
Okay.
Margaret?
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
As I know, many people on this call were on the training yesterday as well for the renewals. And my head is spinning a little bit. I apologize if I'm not getting everything at the first time through. But with the renewals, now again, there's a lot of things you went over today as a new application. I understand the difference. But with the renewals, like, we have a transitional housing as a renewal.
Yes.
So now do we have to do, like, I feel like I don't remember yesterday you went over all these things. Maybe you did. Like with the service requirement, so
I believe
I'm a
the
little.
20-hour. Go ahead, Lauren.
That only applies to new transitional housing projects.
Oh.
So as a renewal transitional housing project, right, we've got some renewal transitional housing projects that are in tier 1 and they're just going to apply as renewal transitional housing.
Yep, that's what.
Some of the things we talked about, you're still going to need to do, right? You're going to go through your project application and make sure you're not talking about housing first.
Yeah.
Yes.
I get that. Yeah.
But the rest of this, you're not going to need to do. For
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I'm happy for that, but it doesn't seem quite fair, but I'm happy. Yeah. Thank you. Yep.
Other questions?
Not seeing other questions. No hands up.
We appreciate you guys, and we appreciate your patience with us as we also try to navigate what is. I've been doing this for 30 years, and this is by far the most difficult COC competition we have ever done. And so we appreciate how hard this is. And we are grateful for all of you and for your kindness and graciousness as we work as fast as we can to figure this out. And we see that there is a broken link, and we will be sure that that gets fixed and updated in the materials. Thank you for letting us know. Always let us know when there are broken links, please.
Yeah. Lisa, you have your hand raised.
Hey, yes, Shannon, I just have a question. I didn't know if maybe you and Lauren can stay on after for a quick question for me.
Yep.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. I think we are at the end of our time. So